My guest today is Marcus Harris. He's a Chicago-based global technology attorney at Saul Ewing Arnstein and Lair LLP. Our conversation centers on recent news that software companies like SAP and McAfee are allowing Russian government entities to view their source code, and why, as a software litigation expert, he thinks that is a bad idea.
This has been going on for probably, I would say at least a couple of years, where in order to gain access into the Russian market, which is a multi-million-dollar market that's incredibly desirable for companies like SAP, Symantec, McAfee, Oracle, to enter, what the Russians are doing as a requirement of entry into their marketplace, they're requiring that software companies provide these Russian entities, which are typically agents of the Russian government, either explicitly or implicitly, to have access to the source code of the software, with the pretense being that the Russians want to review the software source code in order to make a determination as to whether it has any vulnerabilities in it.
Is there a reasonable argument that they can make that this is an anti-espionage tactic, for example?
I think they have made that argument, and I think it's certainly a reasonable argument. But where that argument starts to become suspect, I think, is when the software is going to be utilized in really a non-governmental application. So if that software is going to be utilized in a business that really has very little dealing with a Russian governmental entity, I don't see what the purpose of any kind of a substantive source code review would be. So I think, if they're going to pin their hat on an argument that, hey, this is important because we need to make sure that our governmental interests are not going to be compromised, it doesn't make a lot of sense the farther removed you get away from actually utilizing that software in a government entity.
And so what's the risk here? If this is a consumer software or something that people are using to run their businesses, it's not a military situation or anything like that, what is the downside for us?
Well, I think there are a number of risks, and I actually do think that there are really at least two substantive arenas where this becomes risky. And the first is certainly from a national security perspective. You've got Bill McDermott in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with President Trump touting that, and Bill McDermott, by the way, is the CEO of SAP, which is one of the companies that has provided the Russians with the ability to access and review their source code. Bill McDermott is sitting there in the White House touting that both the Army and the Navy utilize the SAP software in their operations. So from that perspective, I think certainly it's a national security issue. But I think from a general business perspective, I think there's a lot of vulnerability and a lot of risk that any business owner that utilizes enterprise software needs to be aware of, and that's a very large number of businesses. I mean, enterprise software today is very much the backbone of the way modern business is conducted, and I would bet that virtually all companies of any size are going to utilize an enterprise resource software application, whether it's in the cloud or on premise. And to the extent that your vendor has made its code available for review to a hostile government entity, like, say, the Chinese or the Russians, in the case of China in particular, that country doesn't have a good track record of protecting intellectual property, and actually has a track record of commercial espionage, trying to obtain proprietary information, confidential information, so that it can utilize in its own, for its own economic interests. I think that's a big deal, because I think then what happens is that you don't know what the substantive risk associated with using that software could potentially be. And I think you have to take reasonable steps to safeguard yourself from at least the possibility that your vulnerable information, your trade secrets, your proprietary information, your confidential information could be vulnerable to a greater extent than it would otherwise have been had these companies not provided the key to the factory shop to these hostile government entities. So I think it's a huge risk.
I remember, I think it was back in the 90s when the U.S. government classified certain types of encryption as munitions, so it was illegal to export them. Do you think we need that sort of oversight where the code behind some of these software packages, the distribution of it gets oversight by the feds?
Yeah, I think so. I think the example that you raise is a good one because there's all sorts of regulations associated with encrypted software, depending on the type of encryption. There's regulations as to what countries that particular piece of code or product can be exported to, and I think there needs to be a very deep dive into what kind of government regulations need to be applied to this type of scenario. I think if there are certainly going to be government entities that are utilizing software where that software's source code has been disclosed essentially to the United States' enemies, I think certainly there needs to be regulation of that, and it needs to be prevented or at least managed very carefully. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult to tell these companies what to do with their source code to the extent that it's not something like encryption where it can be readily used against the country's interest, the United States' interest. But I certainly think that this kind of blatant review for the purposes of understanding the software, understanding its vulnerabilities, under the guise of protecting, the Russian government, for example, but really for the purpose of facilitating hacking and the like. I mean, some of these government entities on the Russian side that actually access the software or the source code are some of the same government entities that are allegedly responsible for hacking into the DNC's email system. So, there's a substantial risk, and I think government regulation needs to come, and it needs to come quickly in order to manage this process.
That's Marcus Harris. He's an attorney with Chicago law firm Saul Ewing Arnstein and Lair, LLP. And that's the Cyberwire. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the Cyberwire possible, especially to our sustaining sponsor, Cylance. To find out how Cylance can help protect you through the use of artificial intelligence, visit Cylance.com. And thanks to our supporting sponsor, E8 Security. Follow the behavior, find the threat. Visit e8security.com to learn more. The Cyberwire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our show is produced by Pratt Street Media with editor John Petrick, social media editor Jennifer Iben, technical editor Chris Russell, executive editor Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.